Got a good crowd for Bible study this morning. We're glad you're here. You want to go ahead and be turning your Bible to the book of Judges. If you want to turn to chapter 18, we've got a little bit of reviewing this morning, recapping of some chapters at the end of the book to kind of fit between our discussion questions. We have just two questions this morning. Today we are finishing our study of the book of Judges, which means that we are in the part 2 of that study of the sins that destroy nations. And there are a few extra copies of that on the back table if you wish to have a copy of that. Also on that back table in the auditorium are 2 pages that will go along with our study beginning next week on the book of Hebrews. And all we're doing next week is introductory material. So we're not going to spend a lot of time on the introduction, just one Sunday. That's our first official lesson. We're going to talk about purpose of the book, why it was written, if there's anything that we can tell at all about the dating of the book, is it early or late? We'll try to sort of survey the question of who wrote the book and offer some suggestions as to who may have done that, and go through some of the arguments pro and con against the people who are suggested to have written the book. And we'll just do things like that. We'll talk about the sort of generally what the book is about, what we can expect to see in it, and then we'll move on. So there's a couple of pages that you'll want to add to your notes for our study in the book of Hebrews. And if you'll go ahead and study that, by the time we get together next week, we'll all have something to say in class, and class will be even better for it. Okay, so chapter 18 of Judges, we're finishing out our study of Judges today, and we've got a little bit of recapping to do in some of the chapters. We're not going to spend a lot of time in the chapters. We might just sort of survey the story, just generically state what the story is about. And we do want to sort of focus on the last 2 of these sins that we're listing as sins that destroy nations. Let me read the first discussion question, and then since chapter 18 is not part of this discussion question, we're just going to quickly talk about chapter 18 and then review chapter 19 and then take a look at the question. Here's the question. Explain the events of chapter 19. And I mean, let's just talk generically about what's going on. What types of sexual crimes are discussed in this chapter? And if you've read it, it's not just one. There's actually a few in this chapter that take place. What were the requirements under the law regarding sexuality? Did the law legislate things regarding sexuality? And what about today under the New Testament? Are there requirements when it comes to human sexuality? And thinking more broadly, why do God's standards of marriage and the home, including human sexuality, because that's what it would be confined to, why do they matter to nations? What's the impact of that to a nation? What are the consequences to nations that disregard the sanctity of marriage and the home? And do you think, speaking specifically of our country, do you think in America we're experiencing consequences directly related to the breakdown of the home or sexuality? Name some of those if you can think of some, and what can the church do individually and congregationally to make a difference? So we're taking one question and kind of breaking it down in application. Let's begin with, first of all, really quickly, chapter 18, because this is not, we don't have a question on it. We said last week we'll just try to do a quick follow-up on that. If you read ahead and you were studying Judges this week, you probably saw immediately the connection between chapter 18 and chapter 17, because chapter 18 is what happens in the aftermath of that. Remember, there was a man by the name of Micah, and he's wanting to set up a temple, a sanctuary, a tabernacle in his house. And he's able to sort of organize a mini priesthood for himself in his house. First of all, he appoints one of his sons to do it, and then he finds out that there's a man who very likely in descent comes from Levi, at least on one side of his family, and he offers him money if he'll be a priest in his house, and he makes images, carved images. He makes the ephods out of some of the money that his mother gave him. And that story ends in verse 13 with Micah saying, now that I've got myself a priesthood in my house, God will be favorable to me. Well, chapter 18 follows that story. And interestingly, one of the first things we find in chapter 18 is that apparently Dan has not settled in an area yet, so they're sort of without an inheritance, and that kind of sparks the story because there's a group, they go out looking for a place to go, and as they're traveling, they run upon the household of Micah, and they meet the Levite, his name is provided in the text, his name's Jonathan. They meet this man, and essentially they say, well, how come he has a priesthood and we don't have one? And so they conspire, and eventually they're able to sort of take his priest and peel him away from Micah's house. And their argument is, why would you want to be a priest of just one household? Why don't you want to be a priest over an entire tribe of people? And they're able to actually get him. So they take all the ephods, the carved images, they take all that away, and the priest from Micah's house. And just sort of looking very quickly down about verse 25 and following, that's pretty much what happens. They steal away the priesthood, and they eventually settle about verse 27 and following in a place in Laish, which is named Dan. Verse 29, they call the name of the city Dan, and named the name of Dan of their father who was born in Israel. However, the name of the city formerly was Laish. And verse 30, they set up the carved image. Jonathan, the son of Gershon, the son of Manasseh, his sons were priests to the tribe of Dan until the day of captivity of the land. And that's how the story ends. So you have sort of a follow-up story to chapter 17. It wasn't part of our discussion last week. That gets us to chapter 19. What are your impressions of chapter 19? Really decent moral story, or did you find it real gritty and hard to read? It's just, and this is real life. These are things that happened in history, and we just have a record of that. But a lot of the things that happen here, especially the follow-up in chapter 20, they're not pleasant things to read here. But in chapter 19, you have at the very beginning a certain Levite in verse 1. He was staying in the remote mountains, and according to verse 2, or verse 1, he takes for himself a concubine. Now, the beginning of that story is you just have this interaction between him and his father-in-law and his concubine wife, and there's not a lot adventurous taking place, except he goes to visit the house of his father-in-law, and he keeps him there. Remember, he said, well, why don't you stay one more day and eat a meal? And they just sort of linger, and the time passes until eventually he needs to leave, and it's on the way back that the story takes a very strange turn, because they come to the city, and while they're there, in verse 22, what happens with the men of the city beginning in verse 22? What happens in the story? They're staying there, and earlier in the story, one of the dwellers of the town comes out and said, well, why don't you don't need to spend the night in the square. Come on out and spend the night in our house. And goes back, and they're in the man's house. And what happens in the story? It almost sounds just like what happens with Lot. Art, you had your... Yeah. Is that what you're going to say? It sounds so similar. The story sort of plays out like that. The men of the city come to the household of the man who's offering his hospitality to this Levite and his concubine. And what do the men of the city want? They want the man because they want to have sex with him. Notice in verse 22, bring out the man who came to your house that we may know him carnally. And the story plays out a lot like what's in Genesis chapter 19. The man, verse 23, the master of the house went out to them and said, no, my brethren, I beg you, do not so wickedly, seeing this man's come to my house. Do not commit this outrage. In verse 24, he goes, look, here's my virgin daughter, and here's this man's concubine. Let me bring them out, humble them, do with them as you please, but do not to this man, do not do such a vile thing. And the men would not heed him. So the man, and this is the Levite, he took his concubine and brought her out to them, and they knew her and abused her all night until the morning. And when the day began to break, they let her go. And as tragic as that is, if you've read ahead, it's even more heartbreaking, because what happens? She crawls her way back to the door of that house, and she dies at the doorstep. And when they open the door, they find her. She'd breathed her last breath right there. She was able to have the strength to crawl her way all the way back. And at the very end of that story, Terry mentioned it's pretty gruesome. He takes and he divides her body and cuts her up in 12 pieces and shops her all over to the tribes of Israel. So that in verse 30, there's the shock value of it. They say, no such deed has been done or seen from that day that the children of Israel came up from the land of Egypt until this day. Consider it, confer, and speak up. I mean, it's a tragic story. There's so much wrong with what happens in this, but it's just terrible. It's just a terrible, terrible story. So there's a couple of things that just kind of pop off of the page, because as tragic as this is, that kind of epitomized what was going on sexually in that day, and you kind of get a sense of why that nation was so in trouble with God. So what are some of the sexual sins that you saw in this chapter? Let's go back to the beginning. Go back to verse 2. Well, it's in verse 1 and it's in verse 2. First of all, what is this lady called? His concubine. What's that mean exactly? Yeah. Yeah, she's actually called the wife, so you're correct about that. I struggled with this because I don't know that it implies he had other people, which generally concubine, you would think you have a wife and then take somebody else like a harem beyond that. But concubine would seem to suggest that even in their marriage, she did not have all the rights of a normal wife. And I don't know why that was the case. I don't know why that is mentioned here. There's some sort of an arrangement here that disallows her the status or the rights, the full rights of a wife, even though she was a wife, like Joel mentioned. So there's some sort of and you see it later because he's not really respectful of this woman. In fact, in just a minute, he's going to say, well, here, take my concubine. He kind of tosses her out the door and lets them rape her. So there's already that going on. Well, look at verse 2. She goes, and what does she involve herself in? Harlotry. I mean, she goes back in harlotry. And that was very characteristic of the pagan religions of that day. But there's harlotry and fornication. And of course, that was not right under the law of Moses. But what was also not right under the law of Moses was in Leviticus chapter 20 and verse 10. If someone had gone and committed adultery, what was the consequence of adultery? You get put to death along with the person you've committed the adultery with, according to Leviticus 20 and verse 10. So there's harlotry and fornication. Then in verse 22, you see there's homosexuality, right? So you see them when the males of the city, ask for another male to come out that they can know him carnally. And it's interesting, the language is almost identical to the language of Genesis chapter 19. And then in verse 25, another sexual crime is committed when the men of the city take and they rape the woman essentially to death. They rape her until she has almost no life in her, and she, verse 26 and 27, she makes it back to the doorstep of the house where she was put out of, where she dies. But you see those. Now, the Old Testament and the New Testament, do they have different standards of sexuality, or in principle, are they the same? What's the standard? What's authorized regarding human sexuality? Okay, so at the very beginning, what was it? Yeah, okay, so at the very, very beginning in Genesis 2, right, beginning in verse 18, when God sees that man is alone, it's not good for him to be alone, which is part of the creative process. He makes the woman for the man and brings them together. It is a monogamous relationship. It's meant between one man and one woman, but sexuality is limited to that arrangement, and it's a heterosexual relationship. It's a man and a woman coming together, and it's only allowed within that setting, only allowed within that. And the same in Matthew. If we were to go to Matthew chapter 19 and look at Jesus reflecting back on that, the standard in the New Testament is exactly the same. In in our world today, there are probably fewer people than ever who agree with what the Bible teaches on that. Our morality is shifting. The view of sexuality is shifting in our society. It does not change the fact, though, that as much as people may disregard the standard for the home and sexuality within the home, it doesn't change the fact that God made it so that the home, including human sexuality, the home is the bedrock of a nation. Every nation is only as strong as the homes that are within it. And interestingly, God is the strength of the home, and so God really is the strength of a nation, but it's the homes that provide a bedrock for a nation. And why is that true? Right? So let's get to some of that application, since we're talking about the sins of nations, and they weren't doing too well back then. Why are families structured according to the Bible? Why is that so good for nations? And there's no wrong answer here. What do you think, Art?
You want to go out and fight for just any old thing? Or do you want to fight so that your family has a future?
Right. Yeah, so it provides a value to a nation that wouldn't be there otherwise. What else? Yeah, it's certainly God's design for the home. There's always trouble when you leave the divine pattern for anything, and the home is certainly the case. You see corruption that follows after that. What other good qualities do it? When you have families and homes, and I hate to use the word traditional because it makes it sound man-made, but when we say traditional, like they say it, we're a man and a woman. We mean biblical, right? Why is that good for nations? All right, it keeps it healthy. All right, so it's by design. It keeps it healthy. It provides value to it. What else, Tommy?
Well, when you do what's right, within itself, it teaches proper values.
All right.
And children coming up in a stable home can learn those values and continue on when they get old enough to have their own family when those values are not there.
Yeah. Do you think as a whole that when you have homes that are trying to be like God wants them to be, that you end up with a better citizenship within a nation? There's a respect for authority that's taught in godly homes that carries over, right? So you can have God-fearing children, but that converts into better citizens within a nation because you have people who understand authority and they understand how that structure works. There's trust built in homes that sort of lends itself to the integrity of a nation as well. And the importance of truth is taught in homes, and honesty that carries over into a nation. Carl mentioned, wellness, but it's not just mental, but also physical well-being is tied to the home, and character is built inside of a home and carried over into a nation. And when you see the destruction of the home, well, it's not very long before you start seeing the foundations of a nation erode, because all those things that are qualities built within inside the home, they're lacking in a nation now. So when a nation loses its moral anchor, like what was happening here in Israel at this time, it drifts into a lot of things. But this chapter illustrates that when it loses its understanding of the sanctity of the home, one of the first things to break down is sexuality. And you see sexual immorality sort of pour into a nation and the consequences of that. So, for example, in this chapter, and we tend to think, we do it unconsciously, we think, man, nobody really understood the onslaught of homosexuality like we do today. Did they struggle with it back then? There's never been a time in nations when people didn't struggle with that, because the devil's always corrupted nations through sexuality, and they struggled with it. And they were beating on doors begging for people to come out where they could rape people back then. So they struggled with it. But when sexual immorality starts to plague a nation, when you see perversion in sexuality, what are the consequences of that to a nation? What are the practical consequences of that? When you see perversion like homosexuality, or you see rape prevalent in a society, what happens as a result of that morally? It is.
Lack of appreciation of authority,
Yes.
lack of value of human life. Look at abortion, look at the mass killings. You know, there's several things, but that is, I think, a major portion of that. What the issues that
All the pieces of the pie are connected. You're right. Yeah. If you have a nation that turns to sexual perversion, does it also at the same time try to hold up and respect the home as God made it? Do you see in our nation a turning against the traditional home in preference of sexual perversion? So you can't have one without the other. And like Joel's saying, it's all pieces of a pie. And when you start taking those pieces of the pie out, they're all connected. So the whole is affected by that. Moral limitations, they always get removed when people prefer sexual perversion. The question always is, if you're going to endorse as a nation one act of sexual perversion, does it open the door for others? And we struggle right now mightily with homosexuality, but is that going to open the door for other sexual sins? Yes. And already now there's movements about, we can't even say the word pedophile anymore. We just have to call them minor attracted people. That's what happens when sexuality is destroyed, is that it just opens the Pandora's box of perversion. Why not bestiality or polygamy? Those things, they stand on the other side of the door once one part of that door is opened. Who suffers the most in that, though? In all areas of sexual perversion, who almost always is the one that suffers the most in that? Children are the one that suffer the most, because they don't have examples, and they're the ones who are most subject to the perversion. Religious freedom is always jeopardized as a result of that. And you kind of see the breakdown of religion in chapter 17 and 18. You just see it by this faux priesthood that's set up. And then going back to what Carl said about health, you certainly see an uptick in disease and unhealth in a nation. So it's certainly important, if a nation wants to be healthy, that it respects the sanctity of the home. And you see in Israel at this time, there was no king in Israel. Everybody just did what was right in their own eyes, and you see a breakdown of all of that. Any input, any questions, any thoughts on that before we move to question number 2? Because I want to get to some of the latter two. Well, that was the end question. So what do we do as individually or congregationally? What can we do to try to change that? What do we do? And again, there's no wrong answer. I didn't ask that. It was part of the question, but that's a great point by Carl. Let's talk about that. What can we do?
you have to be willing to stand and defend the faith, and within the faith is morals and respect for authority and
Yeah.
those things. We can't force anybody to do anything.
No.
What we can do is teach.
Yeah, 2 Corinthians 10, 3, beginning verse through verse 6. We have to change hearts. We have to change minds. And so we have to become very effective in the way we communicate the truth. And, we're not limited to just simply, and don't take this the wrong way, it's not limited simply to quote the Bible. We can actually take the social effects of sin and say, look practically at what rejection of God's Word is doing. Look at our nation, how sick our nation is. Look at this. And you can see that these actions are not right just based on the ill effects of that. But I guess I'm largely bothered, and you see evidences of this where every now and then somebody will stand up and they'll do something, and I'm getting on a soapbox now. I remember when there are certain resolutions that have been in certain areas where they're all about marriage, about polygamy, or about limit LGBTQ exposure or transgenderism exposure and things. And I see all the religious groups stand up and they band together, and there's a voice and there's a movement and there's people on TV, and they're just making themselves present. And I always think, where's the church? Where's our voice at? We are so silent on these things. And I agree with Tommy 100%. We shouldn't be ugly about it, and you can't force people to do it. But where are we in standing up and saying, look, God loves homes, and here's how He wants it, and we will be well if we do that? And we've got to use our voice more than we're using it, okay?
In our class here, young parents, but that's one of the places that voices really need to be heard.
We have to teach.
Our younger son will soon
Yeah.
be 50,
Yeah.
and when he was in elementary school, they were teaching situation ethics.
Yes.
And when is stealing maybe not wrong?
All right.
When is this and that, you know? Too many parents won't go confront that in a nice way, but go say, hey, you know, this is not what my child is being taught.
And that teaching that.
That's why it's advanced to the point it is.
And I 100% agree with that, because part of that fear is evidenced in the home where we're not talking with our children about these things. I am very aware that if I do not teach my children what sexuality is according to the Bible, somebody else is going to teach it to them. And they're going to end up with a very perverted view of sexuality if that kind of training doesn't start in the home and reinforced in the church. And we don't have to be gross about things, but it's got to be reinforced in every area where they need to have it reinforced in order for us to start making changes. And then it starts small. It's a chain reaction. I teach them, they teach others, and it starts to permeate. But we can't stay silent about it, because it's just sin is an addiction, and people love sin, and when it feels good and it's pleasurable, they just sort of dive deep in it, and it just takes them down a rabbit hole. Yes. We are, yeah. We've been given a great task of standing up and exposing darkness and preaching truth. We have to do that. No, it's every Christian's job to do that. I just think as individually and as a congregation, as God's people, we've not been incredibly vocal in stating, very kindly stating, here's what God says about that. And I don't know, but just sort of, it's like as long as we're safe in these walls, and as long as we feel like we're safe here, then that's fine. But if I read the gospel correctly, Christianity was revolutionary, and it was it sought to change the world and stem the tide of sin. Paulette?
On the flip side, we are vocal on Facebook.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Knocked out, you know, you put in jail. You can't say anything. We
Yeah.
have to be so careful, like, we can't give Bibles, you know, to the kids at school when we do like a hygiene pack or something.
Yeah.
We have to be so careful about what we can say, because we're being silenced, but on the other hand, LGBT,
Yeah.
are,
The-
you know, they are able to do what they want to.
And I'm still not convinced that represents the majority of people in our nation. I'm still not convinced of that. I think people are just quiet, but I think most people don't like that. And I think most people see the value in traditional family. And even from a non-biblical perspective, there's a social value to traditional families that people are able to see, and the value of that to children, because children grow up messed up when they don't have that traditional thing. Ken?
Those people have recognized the value in being loud and
Loud.
pushing stuff down
Yep.
people's throat.
Yep.
And not that we should be mean about it,
No.
but I think we have to do the same thing.
Yeah, I think so.
We have to stand up and go, no, that's
Yeah.
not right.
Yeah, I think so. All right, quickly, let's move to number 2 question. This gets us into Judges chapter 20. And these stories are all sort of semi-connected, because chapter 20 follows up with chapter 19, right? So you have all that sexual crime at the very end of chapter 19. That man takes and he cuts his concubine up in 12 pieces, and he sends her pieces all over as a statement at the end of that in verse 30. So in chapter 20, here's the question. What happens in chapter 20? What's the follow-up to that? There seems to be a long history of the kind of thing that happens in chapter 20 in the Old Testament. Does infighting happen today in nations? Do you think this is happening in America? And if so, why do you think it's happening? Why do you think, based on Bible teaching, that people within nations turn on each other? And in our case, why do you think our nation is so divided? Because we sure seem to be that way right now. Is there an answer to that? And if so, what do you think would help restore unity in our land? And we'll do it in the same context as the church. How do we help that? And we're not advocating for, it's not a political statement. We're trying to restore one type of political system, but it's just there's got to be an answer to that because it's not moral what's happening. So let's start with the first question, chapter 20. What's chapter 20 about? So he sends these pieces everywhere, and what happens? Oh man, the people they don't like that at all. So they want revenge on the folks that committed the crime and against all the people that are connected to it. So there's this meeting. Verse 2, the leaders of all the people, all the tribes of Israel presented themselves in the assembly of the people of God, 400,000 foot soldiers who drew the sword. So they're all there, and there's this gigantic meeting. And verse 3, parenthetically, the children of Benjamin heard that the children of Israel had gone up to Mizpah. And so the children of Israel said, tell us, how did this wicked deed happen? What happened that a woman had to be divided in 12 pieces and sent to provide that shock value? And so the Levite stands up and he answers. And in verse 4, the Levite, the husband of the woman who was murdered, answered and said, my concubine and I went to the Gibeah, which belongs to Benjamin, to spend the night. And he tells the story. And verse 5, they intended to kill me, but instead they ravished my concubine so that she died. Now he forgot a piece of the story, which is, I pushed her out the door and left her to die and found her dead body at the doorstep the next morning. But he sounds like he's playing the victim here. Look, woe is me, look what happened. And he stirs up a controversy, and all of a sudden now there's war being declared against the Benjaminites. So you have the entire chapter settles on this. Now, to be fair, as you go through the chapter, there was an issue of morality. There was an issue of morality at stake. They did rape the man's concubine, and as a result of that, she died. They did do that. He's not innocent like he seems to suggest that he is. And interestingly, if you go over to, and by the way, this is just Bible language. It's over in, we'll find it in just a moment. He calls the actions of the people in that city perverted. I mean, that's Bible language for that. So there was certainly an issue there. And God, verse 23 and following, he actually commands the war against the Benjaminites. So I don't want to suggest that they do this against God, because God did tell them to do that when they inquired of the Lord. But there's obviously infighting. Does it seem like that there's a lot of infighting in Israel? It's in verse 13, by the way. That reference was verse 13, by the way. It says, now therefore deliver up the men. And what does it call them in verse 13? Perverted men. That's Bible language, right? So that's not me making that up. When people leave the pattern for sexuality of the home, it's perversion, right? So whatever it is perverted, but they're perverted men, verse 13. Does it seem like in the history of Israel between the tribes, we've already seen it earlier in the book, right? Ephraim was the troublemaker at the beginning. And every time there was some sort of dispute at the beginning, Ephraim would chime in and say, you left us out, and we just want to help out. And they're always doing this, and finally they just turn against Ephraim, and they just nearly wipe out Ephraim by doing this. And now you've got the Benjaminites who are doing this. Does it seem like in the history of Israel that there's a lot of infighting? Now, sometimes it's justified. Sometimes it's not justified. But infighting happens. Not always for a good reason. If people fight over what kind of government there should be, or maybe an economic policy, that's not the best reason to fight. But sometimes infighting happens for moral reasons. Sometimes it happens and there's real division within a nation. So what are your thoughts on that, especially as you think and you apply that toward America? Because you see in the rest of the chapter, they're able to defeat the Benjaminites as God wants them to do, and the situations settled. And then you have in chapter 21, if you've read ahead in chapter 21, there's the issue of of the marriages for those without the wives, because all the women were destroyed, and they find overtaking one place, and they shop the women in from another place, and they gain the wives that way. But infighting, why does it happen within a nation? You know, yeah, what do you think about that, Art?
Have a leader, and you have, without it, you have to have laws.
Yeah.
Without those things, those being followed, and the combination, you have, if everybody's doing their own thing, we hear this in the book here quite often. Everyone did whatever they saw in their own mind, you just have chaos.
Yes.
And every religiously, in a nation, doesn't matter. You don't have a standard, don't have a leader, don't have some laws, you're gonna have chaos.
Yeah. Is that what's happening in America? It just seems like there's such division. Somebody had their hand up. Yeah, Dennis, go ahead.
Politics, the two parties play wedge issues all the time, age, race.
Does it seem like America is more divided than it ever has been? I mean, I know there's always been division between parties, but it sure feels like people talk about, are we hopelessly divided? I wouldn't say hopeless, because I think there's always an answer to every division that exists in the world. And Dennis mentioned the two parties, right? And so, I hate politics. I hate it. And I know you get sick of it as well. I can't stand it. I can't stand this thing. I can't stand it. Is the division between the two parties, because it seems like those are your choices today, right? Is it just on fiscal policy? Is it just on expanded government or smaller government? Is that what it's all about, or does it seem like other things are driving the division today? Yeah, Tommy?
I think the decline in morals in our country is really expressed in our leaders, or I'll say elected officials, because half the time they don't lead. There's too much greed, too much me in their decisions, rather than looking out for people. They're looking out for themselves, and when people do that, they forget about what is good and right
Yeah.
for the whole. It just comes down to selfishness and greed, and a total lack of acknowledgement and respect for God.
And a lot of the issues that drive the separation are moral issues. And so those are issues on both sides. People feel like because they're deeply passionate about the morality of both sides, or immorality on the other side, it just seems as though that's ground people are unwilling to yield. And so it seems as though there's a lot of division, and it's not over should we have another federal agency or not a federal agency. And there's debate over that. It seems like it's much deeper division because there's things at stake, like should we murder babies, and should we not murder babies, and those are big issues. Somebody over here, and then Carl.
Something that hasn't been mentioned, it's quite obvious as to what they're trying to do. They're trying to convert this country into a liberal country.
Yeah, it just morally speaking, I have grievances with both parties for helping that along. I just don't like it at all. Carl? Yes, and lose touch. So real quick, let's go back to this. Is there a solution for it? And if so, where do we come in at? Yeah, deaf ears. He just mentioned, and Carl did. So I agree with him completely. That a lot of people won't listen, but there is an answer. Let me ask you this: are people going to listen to the voice of the church about how God can bring people together when congregations themselves are guilty of infighting? How do you listen to somebody and respect the values or the opinions of somebody when we say God is the answer, and then they look at a congregation of people and they're all just bickering and fighting with each other, and they could easily point a finger and say, well, you don't even believe it. So how are we supposed to believe it? It's got to start here, and there has to be such unity within congregations of God's people that other folks wake up and say, maybe that works, and then maybe we can apply that. I don't know the answer, but I know at the end of Judges, when you end Judges starting in chapter 17, what you're looking at is the implosion of a nation of people, and they're not even near captivity yet. They've just given up on God. There's no king in Israel, and everybody's just kind of doing what they want to do. Real quick, any other comments? Yes, Bobby?
For years, the church was silent majority. Most people believe in God, but they allowed things to go on that were outside of God. And they did not stand up and say, this is not right.
Yeah.
Such as abortion.
Yeah. Our voice needs to be heard in a kind way. I think we're capable of making our voice known, and for some, make a difference in that. Pat? Oh, I'm sorry, Brenda. So sorry.
In my opinion, I think it all boils down to one thing.
Yeah.
There are no consequences anymore,
Yeah.
including in the church. When problems arise, different,
When you don't have authority,
there's
there's no consequence.
to people's actions.
Yeah.
And you can't, like you were saying, the infighting in the church, if there's no consequences to that infighting,
It's just going to continue. Yeah, continue. Okay, next week, starting the book of Hebrews, introduction. What do we know about it? What's it about? Who wrote it? What do we know about the book? And what can we expect about Hebrews going into it? It's considered a very difficult book, but for a certain reason, and we're going to talk about that next week. Joel, go ahead.
I expect you to tell us who wrote it.
I expect y'all to know who wrote it. I know the Holy Spirit wrote the book of Hebrews. That's what I know about it. All right, grab your introductory sheets if you haven't already. Please go back and grab that. Do some study on that, and then we'll have chapter 1 notes for next week, and we'll try to do a breakdown of the book of Hebrews. Thank you, guys. Appreciate it.